According to the United Nations Center for Human Settlement, it classifies alternative building materials as traditional materials or materials that are not modern or conventional in nature. Experts also attribute the basics of alternative building materials to include recycled content, low embodied energy, natural materials, energy efficiency, non-toxic or less toxic content. With a housing deficit of over 17 million, access to affordable housing has largely stayed a pipe dream for the vast majority of Nigerians, particularly the middle and lower classes, which takes about 80% of the populace. For many, exploring alternative building materials and encouraging local manufacturing of these materials in Nigeria may be the way to go, so as to ease the task of importing and high foreign exchange. Highlighting the factors militating the use of alternative building materials, Dr. Chi Akpoji, board chairperson of Shelter Afrique, noted that there is a huge housing deficit in Nigeria, which she attributed to high cost of building materials.
There is a major deficit of housing, particularly in this economy, Nigeria, that we are in. And so the supply and demand side dynamics contributing to that deficit. And on the supply side, there are several issues at play, one of which is the high cost of building materials. And then the high cost of building materials, one of the recommendations for mitigating that high cost of building materials that will now impact supply of housing will be to consider deploying alternative building materials.
On her part, Akpoji says it is time for Nigeria and Africa at large to embrace available options for alternative building materials, adding that it is the future for housing construction in Africa.
Alternative building options available could also mean going back to what our ancestors used, traditional building materials, which in the olden days there was no issues with housing because people built houses using mud. And I know in some economies on Africa, they've actually reverted back to using mud to build, energy efficient homes. To round it up, I will say the deployment of alternative building technologies is possibly the future of housing construction in Africa, around the world. It's already been done effectively in other economies around the world, in Asia, Latin America, and so on. So it's time we really put our money where our mouth is and begin to look at how effective it can be in addressing the massive housing gaps, the massive housing deficits within Nigeria. We need to begin to move away from concrete. I know in my experience in the sector, you talk to people on the street and they tell you, if I knock on the wall and it's hollow, I'm not interested. That means it's not a well-built house. But there are alternatives out there that can not only, provide good accommodation, good housing, but also help to address the supply side issues that has bedeviled the sector for so many years.
Also speaking, Odunayo Ojo, CEO, UPDC PLC, says alternative building materials will help cut costs and encourage the use of local building materials.
There's a lot of advancement now that's going on in terms of technology. There is a lot of research that's going into the adaptation of local building materials, like our traditional building materials, adobe blocks, bricks that we have in abundance in this country. We have a lot of stone, we have a lot of limestone that is quarried here in Nigeria that we can use for construction. We're also seeing a lot of technology in terms of modular housing systems where you can build houses faster by inputting some technology processes in the manufacture of houses. So all those things will cut the cost and make sure that the readily available materials we have in the country is what we are using to build.
CEO TAF Africa Global, Mustapha Nje, in his remark, says there is need to adopt the various options available so as to ensure sustainable development.
Well, alternative it depends on different stages. For example, building the structure. There are different models that is coming around now in the world, I can say, where people are avoiding using sand and cement, because traditionally brick and mortar, sand and cement is what is known. But some people are coming with initiatives using laterite dust, compacted bricks, Some are even coming with lighter material like polystyrene and then having it plastered. There are so many alternatives that are coming out, and it is coming out because it is an absolute need for this. Some of the things that we are using now is going to be exhausted. I mean, just imagine sand. You're going to run out of sand at one time. So there is the need to think about alternative building materials for sustainable development.
For the purpose of reducing costs, addressing environmental issues, or dealing with lack of conventional materials, it is time for us to embrace available options for alternative building materials in Nigeria so as to ensure that housing demand meets supply.